Well, I have the good fortune here of having a candidate running for U.S. Senate, Mike Braun, one of the three Republicans running for the nomination, the Republican Party for U.S. Senate, on the phone with me right now. And we're going to talk with him about this Senate seat. We're going to talk to him about really explaining why those in this listening audience should consider going into the voting booth and pressing the button for Mike Braun on May 8th. So, Mike, thank you very much for joining us, sir. How are you today?
Very good.
Well, I appreciate you joining us. So I first wanted to kind of, I guess, position this discussion from my perspective. It appears, again, as someone viewing this from a distance, that the race for the U.S. Senate seat, at least in the Republican primary, is shaping up to be a battle, an argument as to who is the most conservative, and to a certain extent, who's the most, I guess, pro-Trump or Trump supporter. So I want to ask you first and foremost, is that a fair depiction of how you see this? And if so, how do you align with that? How are you, the most conservative candidate or the most pro-Trump supporting Republican on the ballot?
I think that is the kind of the normal way to frame this race, but I'd like to throw one other factor in there. I think for voters to really distinguish among the three of us, it should be, what have you done with your life leading up to this race? And we're all going to be conservative on paper. Of course, everyone's been trying to, say why they, in a bona fide way, would be most likely to support Trump and back him. And I think there's a clear difference there. But I'm going to start first with what I think is the most defining factor. For 37 years, I moved back to my hometown way back in 78, got the opportunity to start with a little company in 81. For 17 years, I had to go through the farm crisis back in the early 80s, and my company that I started with the opportunity to maybe buy into it someday, sold almost all its products to farmers. And I went through that economic downturn and survived it. Had to start a couple other businesses within that small business to just make it through. In other words, had to use my wits and capabilities just to stay alive. And when you do that, you learn things in terms of what conservatism is about in a lot different way than when you've been a politician, your whole career. So I think the main defining factor is, I always say that I've lived conservatism in the trenches, in the real world, and had to put up with the complications and impediments put in front of people like me by bureaucrats and politicians, and it gives you a definitely different perspective. It took me for 17 years just to get beyond 15 employees, and scaled it from 98 to 2008 from 15 employees to 300. And then we go through the automotive crash and the commercial real estate downturn. And I had invested 27 years building a business and came through that again because we had lived a life of conservative principles in my business, and put us in an excellent shape when almost everyone else was staring into a gloomy, horizon. We grew roughly 5 times in size from 08 to 2018, from a regional distributor to a national one, when a lot of other companies were just trying to survive, period. Mm-hmm. You learn by going through that kind of stretch what's important, and I always tell people, when I become the next U.S. Senator, I won't need to be briefed on it. I've lived through it. So I think the background, the difference there in terms of our conservatism is the differentiating factor. When it comes to who's the most conservative, again, everybody is going to be on paper conservative. Who's going to go to Washington and actually hold firm to those conservative principles? And I think, again, there it's clear. At my stage of the game, I'm not doing it to make a career out of it. I'm not going for the pay and the perks, let alone the insurance and the pensions that no one else has. In fact, I'd like to change some of that stuff. So my two opponents, who vote together roughly 95% of the time in the same way, I think look at it differently, calculating their vote to maintain their career in politics, and maybe based upon who's been writing them campaign checks. I'm going to be beholden to no one when I get there, because I've had to largely fund the campaign myself, and the help I'm getting, which has been overwhelming and way beyond what they said you could, is from other frustrated and fed up individuals, a lot of small business people, people that come from the same path that I've come from, not the political insiders.
So let's say you win this nomination and you go up and you face off against Joe Donnelly, who candidly, I mean, really, Republicans, we blew an opportunity in 2012. Of course, there was the situation with Richard Murdoch, which I think was maybe unfairly connected to Todd Aiken in Missouri and so forth. But the bottom line is we lost a seat that really should be Republican. So how does Mike Braun successfully run and defeat Joe Donnelly, who's positioning himself as really the most bipartisan, the most, I don't want to say conservative, but in a sense, the most conservative Democrat? And I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's kind of how he's positioned himself in the Senate. How do you defeat him in a general election?
I think that is very clear again. In the only independent poll that came out, I think he was beating Todd Rokita and Luke Messer in the range of 50 to 35. And in a generic poll out there, a Republican should be beating Joe Donnelly. And Joe Donnelly, I put him in the same category as my two opponents. They built a career in politics, and Joe has got a record, just like my two opponents do in the primary. And his voting record lines up with that of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and I've got a true bona fide record of being a conservative in the private sector, and in the 3 years I was in the state legislature. And I think that when you look at their backgrounds, though, all three of them are very similar. They've come from the farm system of politicians to where you go there, make a career out of it. In Joe Donnelly's case, I don't think he has one original bill that he's authored of any significance in the 12 years he's been a rep and a senator. So I think that, and I generally wrap up any stump speech or debate with the fact that, Rokita and Messer are attorneys that never really practiced much in their own trade. Joe Donnelly as well went right into being in a politically oriented job or an elected one, as their career. And these guys go there, and you might hear a good game in an election year, but never get anything accomplished in Washington. And Joe obviously has got a record that doesn't line up with most Hoosiers when it comes to the fact that he votes in a liberal way, along with party leadership almost all the time.
That's right. And that's something that I think gets glossed over a lot. Joe Donnelly comes back here and he campaigns as a moderate or someone who's bipartisan, but in reality, his leadership is not Nancy Pelosi because he's in the Senate, but that's his leadership. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, he's over there caucusing with Bernie Sanders, with Elizabeth Warren, some radical far left fringe folks. And I articulate this on the show from time to time. He voted to confirm Gorsuch, but in order to do that, and you know this because this is how politics works, he had to go and beg and plead from the leadership to have permission to do that. And so when we elect someone as a Democrat in this state, he might be a moderate, he might be a so-called bipartisan, but when he gets to Washington, D.C., he's going to vote by and large with the liberal agenda, and that is not in the Hoosiers' best interest. So I'm glad to hear you saying that.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And he is going to have an easy record to bust, and I'm going to hold him accountable for it after I win the primary. And I think the key thing voters need to realize is Joe actually runs, ahead of these two guys, and that's because I think voters see all of them as career politicians, And Joe has somehow managed to disguise himself and might get along with certain sectors of Indiana's voter base, but he has a record that is going to be easy to flush out, and I intend to do that.
Sure. And you indicated earlier that your background is different, and I think that's something that resonates with a lot of listeners of this program, a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives in this state, and that's having a business background. And I think something like 90% of our representatives and senators have a legal background, a background in law and so forth. So yeah. My question to
There's
you
no
is,
doubt about that.
What can a businessman...
Todd, because in the first debate, I'll never forget, it was probably after about the second or third time I hammered home that point. Look at your record. Look at your background. And Todd Rokita said this, and it's seared into my memory. Mike, we do not need more businessmen in the Senate. We need more policymakers like me. If there was one phrase in this entire primary campaign that I would tell voters, whether that was a Freudian slip or, just telling the plain old truth, that to me summed up the difference in the primary. And you could say that same thing. I'm sure Joe Donnelly would be comfortable with saying that we need more policymakers in D.C. You're right. Most of them come from a background where they've never lived in the trenches. They've never confronted the issues that you would building a business. And for me, I've not only learned it as a very small business, but had the benefit of scaling one nationally. You ought to see what it's like when you get to a state like California.
Oh, I bet. I bet it's a nightmare.
I didn't think there could be a place worse than dealing with the rules and regulations that the federal government throws at you. There is a place.
The People's Republic of California. So then what does a businessman do? Day one, I'm under no illusion, and neither are the listeners, that there's quick fixes in D.C., but there are systematic changes and rollbacks and things that can be done to move us from this highly bureaucratic, regulated, anti-liberty sort of state that we've evolved into versus moving away from that back towards free markets, back towards individual liberty. So what are some of the first things that a Senator Mike Braun would do if elected and having the opportunity to represent the great state of Indiana in the U.S. Senate?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do at my stage of the game is I'm not going there to sit in the corner or try to please those that have been running the agenda. And I've also been blessed in building a business, and even in the 3 years I was in the state legislature, I know how to use the process to get your points of view across. And that's a kind of a tricky balance. But if you're successful in life, you learn how to coalesce others to get behind your ideas, and you know how to articulate them. Mm-hmm. So a couple of things I would focus on immediately is, through big government and big healthcare, we were delivered Obamacare. Mm-hmm. And that's still a big item out there that needs to be fixed. And believe me, people want something that's going to be a viable replacement. Healthcare is a big issue. For anybody that owns a business, they'll tell you that it's the biggest subset of whatever the essence of their business is that you deal with.
So do you repeal that, Mike? Do you repeal Obamacare? What do you think needs to be done?
I think you repeal it and you get locked and loaded with a good replacement. And I've spent a lot of time in my own business to make that sustainable by incorporating free market principles, despite the fact that the healthcare industry wasn't really wanting to cooperate. But if you are one that knows how to even maneuver around those kinds of roadblocks, it would take more than this interview. But we deconstructed healthcare in our own business, able to set up a sustainable system where my employees have not had to contribute a nickel more in 10 years for a good health care plan. And in fact, when the tax bill went through, we lowered the family contributions by $1,400 a year. You won't be able to find a statement like that anywhere. And we also devised a system where we've made it consumer driven to where we're bringing costs down for health care and getting our employees to buy into their own well-being It just did things completely different from what most employers do and what most insurance companies want you to do, because they were selling you expensive, costly plans that were doing nothing about addressing the cost of health care.
The core issues. Yeah,
I believe
right.
I could walk into that Senate floor, and maybe with the exception of one or two other people weigh in on that and incorporate what we've done in our own business to try to apply it to the principles of not only employer-sponsored health care, but even what the government does. Stuff like that. None of my opponents, primary opponents, or Joe Donnelly, would know much about that at all other than what their staff would brief them on. So that's the kind of thing you'll get from me when it comes to knowing what to do with infrastructure, which is another problem that here in the state of Indiana we addressed. That was a hard decision, but we're in the catbird seat. The federal government being broke, Trump's plan is to try to do a 50-50 match with states that actually got money to match it with. And, I'd be able to walk in there because I was part of it, as a state legislator. And, my business is logistics and distribution. Believe me, I've had to live with complicated infrastructure issues across the whole country and feel good about what I can do there. And then the final thing is, I think you need to go there where you can speak independently and not be beholden to special interests. Special interests, just like they do at the State House, control the agenda and the voting just about as much as leadership does. And when you can go there, knowing that you're not making a career out of it, not beholden to special interests, you can do things like I intend to do, similar to like a guy named Tom Coburn, who was an MD that term limited himself from Oklahoma. And he was known most to true conservatives that he was busting all the waste and craziness in D.C. I'll do that, and if I can't do it through the committee structure, I'll speak up outside of that. I'm not going there at my stage of the game to sit back in the corner and do nothing, to build a career at it. I want to have impact in a meaningful way.
Okay. Well, Mike, let me, we went longer here. Can you maybe stick around for a couple more minutes? I need to stop and take a break.
Sure.
Okay. Let me stop and take a break.
Can.
And we'll resume this conversation after the break. You're listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Back in just a minute. Okay, so I've been on the phone with Mike Braun, running for the Indiana Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. And we've been talking about the 2018 midterms, issues that are important to Hoosiers. And Mike, this campaign, I think many folks would say, and you would probably, I think, agree, it's gotten a little bit, we'll say tense at the least, and maybe downright, rough on each other here lately.
Yeah.
A lot of folks, I've seen ads, our listeners have seen ads that are depicting you as either a rhino or a Democrat. And again, I'm asking this not to just explain to the listeners why, explain that situation, why that's, I'm presuming not accurate or what have you.
Thanks for asking it. That question gets asked all the time. And first of all, the acrimony in this race started way before I ever got involved with it. Todd Rokita and Luke Messer, I think, had a history. And I think Todd Rokita, who went at Luke Messer hard on a couple issues, and maybe they were bona fide, I think set the tone. And the one thing he's had that's been out there in a negative way against me, along with another one, is what you just mentioned. And every time he does that, it gives me the opportunity to tell people that I was in one of the 30 or 40 counties in southern Indiana that were as conservative as any in the state, legacy Democratic counties. If you were a lonely Republican, like my wife and I were, and like Senator Messmer back in the days, if you wanted to weigh in on any of your local politics, I wasn't scheming to become a politician someday. I just wanted to be able to weigh in on the government that impacted me most. We never had a contested Republican race in the history of the county until 2011. So almost anybody that was a Republican would pull a Democratic ballot to weigh in on local elections. And then the Clinton years came along, the Obama years came along, and you could see things start to change. And this ought to drive home the point more than anything. Senator Messmer and I were the first two Republican legislators elected in Dubois County in recent history. There was one undertaker back in the 60s. And we are now a red county, and thanks to us and others that stuck their neck out, we swept every race in 16 as Republicans. So it was a case where Dubois County, for anybody that knows anything about it, if it's not the most culturally and fiscally conservative county in the state, I'd love to know which one would be. And finally, the old Democratic legacy of conservative Democrats has flipped because they were embarrassed, being associated with a national party that was so liberal. And I'm proud that due to the fact that I'm the second legislator elected in a county like that as a Republican, I've always been a deep, strong conservative and a Republican. That's Todd Rokita, and he thought it worked with Luke Messer early on to take him out of the race. It's not going to work with me. I've had to outmaneuver people competitively in the business world a lot quicker than either one of them, and that might work. It makes no sense in the southern part of the state, and even when you explain it like that, it makes sense to the rest of the state where, the counties have been legacy red. And the other thing he's come at with me is hiking taxes. Well, if you were against the road bill, the one tax that I voted for would have been the fuel tax. And my constituents in southern Indiana, where we lack roads and they're in worse repair than any part of the state, said, Mike, when you go to the State House, do something about it. And 95% of all Republicans, voted for that bill. Mayors, Republican county councilmen, Republican commissioners, all wanted it and now are loving it because we in Indiana have actually stepped out and done something about our crumbling infrastructure. And by the way, that was Governor Daniels' legacy. That was Governor Pence's legacy. And, of course, Governor Holcomb, that was his signature piece of legislation. That doesn't hold water either. And people see that. They mostly see politicians that have been in there for a career that don't have anything to show for that on their own record and that'll do or say anything to maintain their job in politics.
So you don't. You did though. You're telling me, if I'm understanding you correctly, you voted in Democrat primaries in the southern part of the state. Because when I first heard this, only for local officials. We never voted for state or national candidates on a Democratic primary ballot. We were Republicans, so we voted, of course, for those races in the general. And the reason everybody did that in southern Indiana until that flipped, and that's why we have the supermajorities in the House and the Senate, you had no weigh-in on your local officials. Because the Democrats dominated.
That's the reason, short and simple.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when I first heard that, there was something that Rush Limbaugh instituted back in 2008 that he called Operation Chaos, where he was encouraging Republicans to vote on in Indiana to vote because we had an open primary, and that's what I assumed that this was. But so that's your explanation for that. In order to have a voice in Southern Indiana, you voted on the Democrat primary because those were the folks that were entrenched really in the county. Is that a fair?
Those were the people that we bumped into, my wife and I, as small business people and Republicans and conservatives in our county. And proud to say, when I actually decided to get involved in politics, was the pioneer to set the stage to where, now, just like most of southern Indiana, it's dominated by Republicans because there's actually a structure there now. And the whole thing is flipped to where they are not only the most conservative counties in the state, they're also now Republican counties due to the folks like myself and Senator Messmer that stuck our neck out and actually blazed the trail.
And then the other thing you brought up, and I'll wrap up here because I know we're short on time, but you'd mentioned the gas tax that you voted in favor of as a state legislator. Is that something that you I guess that you stand by? Because that's, Mac, I'll be honest, as a conservative and our listeners, any sort of tax is something, obviously we know we're not anti-tax, but we're anti-more tax because we would say in general that it's out of control
and
what it is.
I agree 100%. And you've got to be smart enough to know, even if you're a fiscal conservative and a hawk like I am, the difference between taxing for consumption versus something where government ought to take care of it at the national level, in the state level, infrastructure. And you got to put that in the context that we lowered income taxes, got rid of the inheritance tax, and capped property taxes. And when I heard from the commissioner of NDOT back in Ways and Means in 2015 that we are already at 7 or 8% of roads in need of repair when it should be 3%, and that politicians, due to they had sloughed off revenues from some sources and not dedicating it to roads and bridges, we fixed all that and put ourselves in a great position now to actually do something to rebuild it. And infrastructure, at least, is tangible. It's an investment. What I don't want through government is we spend so much money where it's consumed and there's nothing to show for it. This is the one exception, and I think you got to be smart enough, just like in business, keep a real low overhead, live a thrifty existence. You're able to afford a down payment on a new warehouse or a major project that you need to do, and you don't wait until the roof falls in before you repair your warehouse. Just use that analogy.
And so essentially you're saying when you look at the tax structure in the state overall, comprehensively, there was an overall positive impact on taxes. You just reallocated how those taxes were collected so that, and it makes sense, obviously, gasoline tax is, people driving vehicles are the ones that are doing the wear and tear on the road. So at least it makes sense to say that money is allocated for maintaining the roads. Is that what you're basically saying? It's not so much that you raise taxes, you guys collectively restructured it? And
Exactly. It was directed. We fixed some problems that prior politicians had created, where we redirected all the sales tax on fuel to roads and bridges. We put together a long-term plan, and believe me, long-term plans are the most difficult things in business and government. And it's mostly because politicians and people in general don't have the discipline and backbone to make the right decisions. And you got to be smart enough to know the difference between short-run and long-run stuff, and something that you got tangible results from and stuff that you consume. And those are fairly simple Econ 101 principles, and I'm thinking that Indiana has got it about right, and the problem had gotten so large that we did not have the wherewithal to do it within the current budget. And those are those tough decisions that you got to make and be able to defend it. And I think we now, with the pickle that infrastructure's in across the country, are being vindicated, because we'll be the only state, or maybe a handful, that will even be able to participate in President Trump's infrastructure plan, which is a 50-50 match, because he knows the federal government is broke, and we can't look to them to fix everything across the country.
Well, I want to wrap up here. In closing, I've asked some questions. We've had a conversation. For those voters that are on the fence, they're trying to decide between Mike Braun, Luke Messer, Todd Rokita. What do you tell them? Ultimately, go in there and vote for you because of what? What would you tell them?
This is the part that you need to keep in mind. I've made my career in the real world, built a successful business over 37 years. 3 of my 4 kids work in it. This is kind of the last thing I really want to do, but I'm fed up with the kind of folks we generally send there that talk a good game, get nothing done, calculate their votes based upon who's been writing a big campaign check or trying to get reelected. And I can say with full honesty, I don't carry that baggage there. I carry a life's experience of getting things done, living conservatism in the trenches. I signed a term limits pledge, and I'm going to try to get a term limits bill passed that would actually work, and there's a way that could be done, I think, where others have tried otherwise. You can count on me to do the right thing. I'm not doing it to build a career. I've already done that.
Well, very good. Mike, I appreciate it very much. Thank you for joining us, sir, and we'll keep an eye on this upcoming primary.
Okay, enjoyed the conversation.
All right, thank you. With that being said, I'm going to stop and take a break. You're listening to the home of conservative, not bitter talk radio. Be back in just a minute.